In the shadows of Renaissance Italy, where holiness and sin danced a macabre waltz, a young girl's innocence was sacrificed on the altar of papal ambition. Lucrezia Borgia, a name that still sends shivers down the spine 5 centuries later, was born into a world where her own father would wear the triple crown of St. Peter while orchestrating her descent into infamy. What happens when the man meant to be Christ's representative on earth transforms his own daughter into a pawn in the most unholy of games? The answer lies in one of history's darkest tales of power, perversion, and the destruction of innocence. The year 1480 marked not just another birth in Renaissance Rome, but the beginning of a tragedy that would echo through centuries. Lucrezia entered a world where the Catholic Church had become a breeding ground for corruption so profound that even contemporary observers recoiled in horror. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, would later become Pope Alexander VI, arguably the most debauched pontiff ever to disgrace the papal throne. But long before his elevation to the papacy, Rodrigo had already begun weaving a web of manipulation around his illegitimate children, with Lucrezia at its center. The Renaissance, despite its reputation for artistic flowering and intellectual awakening, harbored a dark underbelly where morality was negotiable and power was the only currency that mattered. In the Papal States, the lines between sacred and profane had been obliterated. Cardinals kept mistresses openly, sold church offices to the highest bidder, and plotted murders with the same fervor they planned masses. The Borgia family didn't merely participate in this corruption, they perfected it, transforming vice into statecraft. Born out of wedlock to Rodrigo Borgia and his mistress Vanozza de Catane, Lucrezia's illegitimacy should have condemned her to obscurity. Instead, it became the first link in a chain that would bind her to her father's twisted ambitions. Unlike other bastard children of the era who were hidden away or ignored, Lucrezia was groomed from infancy for a specific purpose: to serve as a living treaty, a breathing alliance, a beautiful bargaining chip in the Borgia family's relentless climb to absolute power. The Rome of Lucrezia's childhood was a city where poison was as common as prayer, where assassins lurked in every shadow, and where even the holiest sanctuaries offered no protection from political machinations. The Vatican itself had become a den of iniquity, where orgies were hosted in papal apartments, where the buying and selling of cardinalships was conducted as openly as any market transaction, and where murder was simply another tool of diplomacy. Into this moral wasteland, Lucrezia was thrust before she could even understand the nature of the game being played with her life. Contemporary chronicles paint a picture of a papal court that would have made Sodom and Gomorrah seem virtuous by comparison. The German scholar Johann Burchard, who served as papal master of ceremonies, documented scenes of debauchery that defy belief, including the infamous banquet of chestnuts, where 50 courtesans crawled naked on the floor of the papal palace, collecting chestnuts, while the Pope and his children watched and awarded prizes for sexual prowess. These weren't merely the exaggerations of hostile witnesses, they were the documented reality of Lucrezia's world. Her education began not with prayers and catechism, but with lessons in survival among predators. By the age of 11, Lucrezia had already been betrothed twice, first to a Spanish nobleman when she was barely 10, then to another when political winds shifted. These weren't romantic arrangements, but cold calculations, each betrothal representing a different alliance her father sought to forge or break. The child who should have been learning to embroider was instead learning that her body and her name were commodities to be traded for power. The transformation of Rodrigo Borgia into Pope Alexander VI in 1492 marked the beginning of Lucrezia's true ordeal. At 12 years old, she watched her father ascend to the highest position in Christendom through bribery so blatant that even in an age of corruption, it shocked observers. Rodrigo had literally purchased the papacy, offering vast sums and promised positions to secure the votes needed in the papal conclave. With this ascension came not divine transformation, but an amplification of earthly appetites. The new pope immediately set about using his position to enrich his family and satisfy his legendary lust for power and pleasure. Lucrezia's first marriage at 13 to Giovanni Sforza was orchestrated with the cold precision of a military campaign. The ceremony, held in the Vatican itself, was less a wedding than a political merger. Contemporary accounts describe the 12-year-old bride as stunningly beautiful, with golden hair and an ethereal grace that belied the calculating intelligence already developing behind her innocent facade. But beauty in the Borgia world was simply another weapon, and Lucrezia was being taught to wield it with deadly efficiency. The marriage bed itself became a stage for the family's perversions. Reports from the time suggest that Pope Alexander VI demanded detailed accounts of the consummation, showing an unhealthy interest in his daughter's sexual initiation. Some witnesses went further, claiming the Pope insisted on being present for intimate moments between the young couple, though these accounts remain disputed. What is beyond dispute is that Lucrezia's privacy, dignity, and innocence were sacrificed to her father's obsessive need for control. Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia's first husband, would later make accusations that would haunt her for centuries. When the political alliance he represented became inconvenient, the Pope sought to annul the marriage. Sforza, in retaliation, claimed publicly that the Borgias wanted him gone, so they could continue their incestuous relationship with Lucrezia without interference. Whether born of spite or truth, these accusations found fertile ground in the fetid atmosphere of Renaissance gossip, where the Borgias' actual crimes made even the most outlandish claims seem plausible. The mechanisms of annulment revealed the depths of Lucrezia's humiliation. Her father, the Pope, declared the marriage unconsummated despite 3 years of cohabitation. To prove this claim, Lucrezia was subjected to physical examination by midwives who would attest to her virginity. A virgin wife after 3 years of marriage. The psychological torture of maintaining this fiction, of having her most intimate physical state become a matter of public record and political necessity, marked another stage in her systematic dehumanization. But the cruelest blow came from within her own family. Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, emerged as perhaps an even more sinister figure than their father. Where Pope Alexander VI was driven by lust and greed, Cesare seemed motivated by something darker, a combination of political ambition and what many contemporaries believed was an unnatural obsession with his sister. Handsome, brilliant and utterly ruthless, Cesare became the enforcer of Borgia ambitions, and Lucrezia found herself caught between her father's manipulations and her brother's possessive violence. The second marriage to Alfonso of Aragon offered a brief glimpse of what Lucrezia's life might have been. At 17, she seemed genuinely affectionate toward her new husband, and contemporary accounts suggest a period of relative happiness. She gave birth to a son, Rodrigo, and for a moment it appeared she might escape the web of corruption surrounding her. But the Borgias had made too many enemies, and happiness was a luxury they could not afford. The very affection Lucrezia showed for Alfonso may have sealed his fate, as both her father and brother seemed to view any independent emotional attachment as a threat to their control. The murder of Alfonso of Aragon stands as perhaps the most brutal chapter in Lucrezia's tragedy. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, severely wounded but not killed. As he recovered under Lucrezia's devoted care, she tried desperately to protect him, even preparing his food herself to prevent poisoning. But she could not guard against her own brother. Cesare, allegedly declaring that what was not done at lunch would be done at dinner, entered Alfonso's sick room with his henchmen. Lucrezia and her sister-in-law were forcibly removed, and Alfonso was strangled in his bed. The official cause of death was listed as fever. The psychological impact of watching her brother murder her husband, while her father, the Pope, not only permitted but likely ordered the killing, shattered whatever innocence remained in Lucrezia. Witnesses described her as transformed, the vivacious young woman replaced by a hollow-eyed spectre who understood finally and completely that she was not a person, but a possession. The tears she shed over Alfonso's corpse were the last public display of genuine emotion she would allow herself for years. Following Alfonso's murder, dark rumors intensified around Lucrezia's relationship with both her father and brother. Servants whispered of midnight summons to the papal apartments, of Cesare's violent jealousy toward any man who showed interest in his sister, of a mysterious infant who appeared in the Borgia household, the infamous Infans Romanus, whose parentage was shrouded in deliberate confusion. Papal bulls contradicted each other about the child's origins, with some suggesting Cesare was the father, others pointing to the Pope himself, and all carefully avoiding the question of who the mother might be. The third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, represented Lucrezia's final transformation. At 21, she was no longer the innocent pawn, but a seasoned survivor who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics. The negotiation for this marriage revealed how thoroughly she had absorbed the Borgia lessons. She bargained for position, dowry, and guarantees with the cold efficiency of a diplomat, understanding that if she was to be traded like property, she would at least ensure the best possible terms. Ferrara offered Lucrezia something she had never known: distance from her family. While her father continued to manipulate from Rome and Cesare carved out his own bloody kingdom in the Romagna, Lucrezia began to forge a different identity. She became a patron of the arts, surrounding herself with poets and painters. She proved an able administrator, governing Ferrara during her husband's absences with a competence that surprised those who knew her only by reputation. It was as if, freed from the immediate presence of her father and brother, she could finally become a person rather than a possession. But the past was not so easily escaped. When Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, possibly poisoned, though fever was the official cause, Lucrezia's reaction was telling. Witnesses reported no tears, no dramatic displays of grief, only a cold acknowledgement of the news and immediate concern for her own political position. The death of the man who had given her life but stolen her innocence evoked only pragmatic calculation. Perhaps this was the truest indication of the damage done, that a daughter could learn of her father's death and feel only relief. Cesare's downfall followed swiftly. Without papal protection, his enemies closed in. The man who had terrorized Italy, who had possibly murdered his own brother and certainly murdered Lucrezia's husband, found himself imprisoned, escaped, and was ultimately killed in a minor skirmish in Spain. Lucrezia's response to her brother's death was equally muted, though some observers noted she wore mourning clothes far longer than protocol demanded. Whether this was genuine grief for the brother who had both protected and tormented her, or simply another political calculation, remains one of history's mysteries. The years in Ferrara revealed Lucrezia's remarkable resilience and intelligence. She became fluent in multiple languages, corresponded with the greatest minds of her era, and established a court that rivaled any in Italy for cultural sophistication. The poetry dedicated to her spoke not of her dark reputation, but of her learning, her wit, and her patronage. Pietro Bembo, one of the great humanists of the age, engaged in a passionate correspondence with her that revealed a woman of considerable intellectual depth and emotional complexity. Yet even in Ferrara, Lucrezia could not escape the consequences of her upbringing. Her pregnancies were numerous and difficult. She suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, each loss a reminder of how her body had been commodified from childhood. The physical toll of constant pregnancy — she was pregnant at least 11 times — combined with the psychological scars of her youth to create a woman who was simultaneously strong and fragile, powerful and vulnerable. The children who survived became Lucrezia's redemption and her torment. In them, she saw the possibility of a different life, one untainted by the Borgia legacy. She was, by all accounts, a devoted mother who tried to shield her offspring from the corruption that had defined her own childhood. Yet she must have watched them constantly for signs of the Borgia taint, wondered if the sins of the fathers would manifest in a new generation, feared that the cycle of manipulation and violence would continue despite her best efforts. Her correspondence from these years reveals a woman of surprising depth and complexity. Far from the poisonous seductress of legend, Lucrezia emerges from her own letters as intelligent, cultured, and desperately seeking meaning in a life that had been shaped by forces beyond her control. She wrote of art and philosophy, of statecraft and poetry, but rarely of her past. The silence about her youth speaks volumes. Some wounds are too deep for words. The relationship with Alfonso d'Este evolved into something resembling a genuine partnership. Unlike her previous marriages, this one was allowed to develop naturally, free from the immediate interference of her family. Alfonso, initially reluctant to marry the infamous Lucrezia Borgia, came to respect her intelligence and rely on her judgment. She bore him children who would continue the Este line, finally fulfilling the dynastic purpose for which she had been groomed, but on terms that allowed her some dignity and autonomy. Her final pregnancy in 1519 would prove fatal. At 39, worn down by decades of childbearing and the accumulated stress of her extraordinary life, Lucrezia struggled through a difficult pregnancy. She gave birth to a daughter who survived only briefly, and Lucrezia herself succumbed to puerperal fever days later. Her death was met with genuine mourning in Ferrara, where she had transformed herself from the infamous Borgia daughter into a respected duchess and patron of the arts. The deathbed scene, as reported by witnesses, was remarkable for its serenity. The woman who had lived through such tumult faced death with a calm acceptance that surprised observers. She made provisions for her children, settled her affairs with characteristic efficiency, and received the last rites from priests who served a very different church than the one her father had corrupted. In death, perhaps, she found the peace that had eluded her in life. The historical Lucrezia Borgia bears little resemblance to the poisonous femme fatale of popular legend. No credible evidence exists that she ever poisoned anyone, despite the notorious Cantarella poison being associated with her name. The image of Lucrezia with her hollow ring dispensing death was a creation of her enemies and later romantics who found the idea of a beautiful murderess more compelling than the reality of a brutalized child who survived to become a competent ruler and patron of the arts. Modern historians have largely rehabilitated Lucrezia's reputation, recognizing her as a victim of her family's ambitions rather than an active participant in their crimes. The incest allegations, while impossible to prove or disprove definitively, say more about the Borgia family's reputation and their enemies' propaganda than about any actual events. What is clear is that Lucrezia was systematically abused, emotionally, psychologically, and possibly physically, from childhood onward. The tragedy of Lucrezia Borgia lies not in the salacious rumors that surrounded her, but in the reality of an intelligent, talented woman whose life was hijacked from birth by the ambitions of others. She was denied the basic human right of self-determination, treated as property to be traded for political advantage, and forced to witness the murder of those she loved by those who claimed to love her. That she emerged from this crucible as a functional human being, let alone a capable ruler and patron of the arts, speaks to remarkable inner strength. Her story serves as a damning indictment of the Renaissance's dark side, the way power corrupted absolutely, the way women were commodified, the way even the highest religious authorities could sink to the lowest moral depths. The papal court, that should have been a beacon of spiritual guidance, became instead a cesspool of corruption that destroyed innocence and perverted natural affections. Lucrezia's life illustrates how institutional power, unchecked by accountability or genuine faith, inevitably victimizes the vulnerable. The legacy of Lucrezia Borgia extends beyond her personal tragedy to illuminate broader truths about power, gender, and survival. She represents countless women throughout history who were born into circumstances beyond their control and forced to navigate impossible situations. Her transformation from victim to survivor, from pawn to player, offers a template for understanding how the oppressed can sometimes find agency within oppression, even if that agency is limited and hard-won. In examining Lucrezia's life, we must also confront uncomfortable truths about how history is written and remembered. For centuries, the salacious rumors overshadowed the documented facts. The story of a beautiful poisoner was more marketable than the story of a traumatized child who grew into a competent administrator. This distortion reveals how misogyny and sensationalism can shape historical narrative, turning victims into villains and obscuring the real crimes of those in power. The true horror of Lucrezia Borgia's story is not found in the exaggerated tales of poison and incest, but in the documented reality of a child robbed of innocence, a young woman robbed of agency, and a mother who died worn out by a life that was never truly her own. Born in 1480 as the illegitimate daughter of a man who would become the most corrupt pope in history, she never had a chance at a normal life. Every moment from birth to death was shaped by forces beyond her control. Yet she managed to carve out spaces of dignity, intelligence, and even beauty within the constraints of her existence. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Lucrezia's story is how ordinary it was in many ways. While the specific details of papal corruption and family dysfunction were extreme, the basic pattern of women being used as political pawns, denied autonomy, and blamed for the crimes of men was commonplace. Lucrezia's story is unique only in its documentation and the heights of power involved. Countless other women suffered similar fates in obscurity, their names lost to history, their stories untold. The final irony of Lucrezia Borgia's life is that she is remembered primarily for crimes she didn't commit, while the actual horrors she endured are footnotes. She has become a symbol of female evil in popular culture, her name synonymous with poison and seduction, while the men who actually committed murders and corrupted the church are often portrayed as merely ambitious or colorfully wicked. This inversion of victim and villain represents a final injustice that even in death and memory, Lucrezia cannot escape the web of lies woven around her. Today, as we grapple with issues of power, abuse, and the exploitation of women and children, Lucrezia Borgia's story resonates with uncomfortable relevance. The mechanisms of control, isolation, gaslighting, the destruction of support networks, the normalization of abuse remain depressingly familiar. The way powerful men can manipulate institutions meant to protect the vulnerable, the way victims are blamed for their victimization, the way survival strategies are recast as evidence of evil intent, all these patterns persist in modern forms. What would Lucrezia Borgia have become if born into a different family, a different time? Her intelligence, her resilience, her capacity for learning and adaptation suggest she could have been extraordinary in ways that had nothing to do with scandal or survival. Instead, she became extraordinary in the only way available to her, by enduring the unendurable and maintaining some semblance of humanity despite systematic dehumanization. In this perhaps lies her truest legacy. The investigation into Lucrezia Borgia's life reveals the Renaissance not as a golden age of human achievement, but as an era when the heights of artistic and intellectual accomplishment coexisted with depths of moral depravity. The same culture that produced Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo also produced the Borgia papacy. The same society that rediscovered classical learning also perfected techniques of political murder. Lucrezia stood at the intersection of these contradictions. Her life, a testament to how individuals can be simultaneously products and victims of their time. As we close this examination of one of history's most maligned women, we're left with questions that have no easy answers. How do we judge those who are simultaneously victims and participants in corrupt systems? How do we separate the person from the propaganda? How do we honor the suffering of the dead while learning from the patterns that cause that suffering? Lucrezia Borgia's life offers no simple morals, no clear heroes or villains, only the complex reality of human beings caught in systems of power that corrupt everything they touch. 500 years after her death, Lucrezia Borgia remains a mirror in which we see reflected our own struggles with power, gender, and survival. She was not the poisonous seductress of legend, but something far more disturbing. A human being whose humanity was systematically denied from birth, who was forced to become complicit in her own oppression, and who nonetheless managed to create islands of beauty and meaning in an ocean of corruption. Her story reminds us that the greatest horrors are not found in sensational fiction, but in the documented ways human beings can destroy each other while claiming to act in the name of love, family, or God. In the end, Lucrezia Borgia's tragedy was not that she was evil, but that she was ordinary. An intelligent, talented woman born into extraordinary circumstances that twisted her life into shapes no life should take. She survived what should have destroyed her, found ways to exercise agency within overwhelming constraints, and died having achieved a measure of peace and respect. If there is redemption in her story, it lies not in posthumous exoneration from crimes she didn't commit, but in recognition of the strength it took to remain human in inhuman circumstances. The bells that tolled for Lucrezia Borgia's funeral in 1519 marked the end of a life that had begun with such dark promise. The illegitimate daughter of a corrupt cardinal who would become a monstrous pope, the sister of a fratricidal sociopath, the pawn in countless political games. She had been all these things, but she had also been a mother, a patron of the arts, a competent ruler, and ultimately a survivor. The tragedy is not what she became, but what she might have been if born into a world that valued women as human beings rather than beautiful objects to be traded for power. History's final cruelty to Lucrezia Borgia is that we will never know who she really was beneath the roles forced upon her. The inner life of the woman remains as mysterious as the truth behind the scandals that surrounded her. What did she think in those quiet moments between public performances? What dreams died with each forced marriage, each murdered loved one, each pregnancy that ended in loss? These questions have no answers, only the echoing silence of a voice that was never allowed to speak its own truth. The most chilling lesson of Lucrezia Borgia's life is how power systems can corrupt the most fundamental human relationships. A father's love became possession, a brother's protection became obsession, marriage became transaction, and motherhood became duty. Every natural affection was perverted by the logic of power until nothing remained untainted. Lucrezia's survival required her to navigate this emotional wasteland, to perform love where none existed, to accept abuse as affection, to mistake control for care. Today, Lucrezia Borgia stands as a symbol not of feminine evil, but of feminine endurance. Her story strips away romantic notions about the past, revealing the Renaissance in all its brilliant darkness. She reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that civilization and barbarity can coexist, that institutions meant to protect can become instruments of abuse. Most importantly, she reminds us that behind every historical scandal are real human beings whose suffering should not be forgotten in the rush to sensationalize their stories. The tragedy of Lucrezia Borgia ultimately asks us to consider how we treat the vulnerable, how we use power, and how we remember those who had no choice but to survive by whatever means necessary. She was raised for corruption, groomed for exploitation, and forced into complicity with her own abuse. That she retained any humanity at all is miraculous. That history branded her the villain rather than the victim is an injustice that 5 centuries have not fully corrected. In death, as in life, Lucrezia Borgia remains trapped in narratives written by others, her true self as elusive as the Renaissance's promise of human dignity and freedom.